All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final genealogy class of the fall and of the calendar year 2024. Today, its topic is using obituaries to research your ancestors. We have a couple orders of business to go through before we get going. On here. There we go. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, free to all. So some of you have already noticed here, the chat box is open. If you would like to say hi and tell us where you're joining us from, please feel free to. I see some of you have already done that, and welcome from Florida and Georgia and a few other places I'm seeing. So we do have a few ground rules for the chat box. All chat messages during the presentation and during the Q&A period afterwards should be related to the topic of the presentation. This includes all questions, comments, and any resources you may want to share. I ask also that you please be respectful of me and all other attendees. I will do my best to make sure I get to all of your questions during the Q&A period. If I can't get to your question before the program ends, you can contact me afterwards. I'm putting a link in the chat box to the handout in case anyone hasn't had a chance to download it yet. So, okay, so and also just a couple more things. This program is being recorded. I will be sending a link to everyone who has registered once the recording is up. However, I just want to let you know the department that handles our videos is down to one person for a couple weeks, so it might take a little while. We'll hopefully get to it before the new year, but no guarantees there. I will also be sending a follow-up email to everyone tomorrow that will have a link to the handout, to my slides, and to the chat transcript. So if you miss anything, you don't need to worry. You'll be able to catch up later, so you don't need to worry about writing everything down. So I see one question that I want to tackle. So Sherry's asking if there are previous videos available. Yes, if you go to the Boston Public Library's YouTube channel, there is a genealogy playlist. So we have a bunch of my old classes and some lectures as well with guest speakers. So that's all up on the BPL's YouTube channel. So for those of you who may not know me, I'm Jessie Wheeler. I'm the genealogy specialist here at the Boston Public Library, and I work in the Research Services Department at the Central Library in Copley Square. As I said today's topic is obituaries. So this is geared towards people who are mostly beginning their genealogy research, but there's probably useful information for anyone. So we're going to be covering why obituaries can be useful, some good things to know about them. We're going to talk about obituaries versus death notices, how obituaries have changed over time. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to find an obituary in microfilm and in a database. I will be talking mostly how you can do this through the Boston Public Library, but I imagine a lot of these same procedures will be similar no matter what library you're working from. All right, so first we're going to go all about obituaries. So why are obituaries useful? I often recommend obituaries as one of the first things you should try to find when you're doing family history research and you're researching a particular person. In this, you can find out information about the deceased's life. If there's a really long write-up, you might get some background about where they're from, what their occupation was, any organizations they were part of, their interests and hobbies, and various miscellaneous things about their life. There might also be information about how the person died. That's not always the case. Sometimes you'll get the popular line after a long illness and they won't specify, but sometimes there will be something specific in there. And also you might be able to get information about the funeral. So this can be particularly helpful If the funeral home is mentioned, then that might, and if they still exist, you can try to contact a funeral home to get records. Funeral homes sometimes do have records, and when they do exist, they can be really, really useful. One of the big things is you can find information about the deceased's family. So, for instance, if you're actually looking for someone the deceased may have lived with, like a spouse or a parent or a child, they might be mentioned in there. A lot of times they'll have their parents' names, even if they predeceased them, and they'll list close family members that were survivors or were predeceased them. So, like siblings, children, things like that. So, that can be a good way to find information about those folks as well. And you can also find information about where the person lives. If they, again, if you have a really detailed write-up and you're lucky to get that, they might have information about everywhere they might have lived if someone was particularly well traveled. And related to funeral information, they could also have information about where they're going to be buried. So if you're looking for where their grave site is, that could tell you where they intended to bury them. Again, sometimes things change. Especially if this was a long time ago, the cemetery might be closed, maybe the graves are moved, or maybe the plans changed in between the notice being posted and the actual burial. But that can give you a good idea where they are supposed to be buried. But just some general things to know. So they can be a good source of information, but one thing you need to keep in mind, unless you're talking about the obituary of someone really famous, where the obituary was written by a professional writer who worked for the newspaper and people who had access to research material. For most obituaries, the information is provided by a family or loved one of the deceased. So they might not necessarily be 100% reliable. People might be left out. There might have been family estrangements and parents might not be listed or children might not be listed. Or perhaps the person who submitted the information didn't know the information, or the person was told wrong information and they're passed on what they have. For instance, in a lot of cases these days, the funeral home, there's services, some funeral homes will submit the obituary for you, and you can write up a little thing and fill out a form, and that might be it. So it really depends. So, and this is true generally for any piece of information you find in a record. You don't want to rely on just one single thing to say this is true. You always want to find backup. That's why these are good starting points. You still want to find more information elsewhere. Another thing that's really important and that myself and a lot of my coworkers have found frustrating, older newspapers, they did not have obituary sections. The obituaries were sometimes and not they were not always grouped together. There might be death notices or obituaries appearing in multiple pages. Or if they were grouped together, they're not going to be in the same place every time and they're not going to be marked. They'll just be a little tiny heading that says deaths, and then that'll be it. And another thing to keep in mind, a lot of newspapers today, and this has been pretty common for a couple decades now at least, they'll have indexes at the front that'll tell you what's in what section. This was not the case until relatively recently. So for old newspapers, you're going to have to if you're just browsing through microfilm, for example, you'll have to hunt around a little bit to find them. And so the other thing is, again, things change over time. Nowadays, the obituary section is just called obituaries. We probably have all seen them, but they could also have been in the past just called deaths. Like I said, there might be a little heading that says deaths, might say recent deaths, or it might say something else, or there might not even be a heading if there wasn't a proper section. So that's just something to keep in mind, especially if you're researching from a longer time ago. Another thing to keep in mind, this is related to the person submitting the information. Again, unless you're talking about someone famous and it was really well researched, names could be spelled wrong. Or the person went by a different name that is different from their legal name. So for instance, you might only know the name they went by, but their legal name was used in the obituary. For instance, I have a great aunt who I always knew as Claire. I did not know until long after she died that her first name was actually Mary. So her obituary, I was Mary Claire. Did not know that until she died. That's just something to keep in mind if there's multiple different names a person might have used. Another thing, and we're going to see an example of this later, particularly even up through the 1960s and definitely earlier, married women may often be referred to only by their husband's names. So you would have to know if you're looking for a woman who was married, you might need to just look for her husband's name in order to find her obituary. The other thing that is one of the most important things to keep in mind, not everyone gets an obituary. Even these days, it really depends on, again, unless you're talking about someone famous, there has to be someone who is submitting an obituary for them. If the person didn't have anyone close enough to them or who knew enough about them and knew that information, there might not have been an obituary submitted for them. And there could be other reasons. It could be that the family didn't want to place one for whatever reason, or they couldn't afford to place it because in many cases you have to pay. It's basically a classified ad. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. Just if you can't find an obituary, it could just be there just wasn't one. So I've mentioned already death notices. So they are actually two different things. I will just be saying obituaries. Aside from this slide, I'll be just saying obituaries for the rest of this presentation just for brevity's sake, but obituaries, they are going to be written by newspaper staff or someone close to the deceased. They are longer, they're generally going to be longer and have a little bit more detail, and they will have more biographical information. A death notice will be written by someone close to the deceased. They're very, very short and they don't have a lot of detail. They're gonna, if you look again, even today, the death notices section, it looks like classified ads, which basically is kind of what they are. And death notices, usually the only information they will include will be the date and location of death, and sometimes the funeral information. Sometimes, though, there might be a separate funeral announcement. We're not going to get too much into those because, again, most people don't get those, but that is something that can happen. So this is just like a typical obituary. It's fairly similar to what we would see today. This one is a little bit more remarkable because the way the person died, they were young and it was a really horrific accident. But this is a pretty typical. It'll have the person's name, maybe a little blurb about them, information about how he died, and here you can see in the second paragraph it says where he was born, where he lived, and what his job is, his survivors. So this person had a wife and two children, and it mentions his parents, and information about the funeral, which usually is at the very end, and the burial information is the last sentence. So this is fairly typical and has been pretty typical. You can see this is from 1911. So this has been a pretty standard format for over 100 years. A lot of obituaries will look something like this. And this is a death notice. This is something that is from 1941. Again, they're still pretty similar now. And you can see here, it just basically says where and when they died, that his wife predeceased him, how old he was, and information about calling hours and the funeral, and that's it. It doesn't say anything. You don't really know anything about him other than his name, where he and how old he was. That's really all you can get from it. And again, and most people, especially if you're talking about the Boston Globe, if they have any kind of information about their death, it's for a lot of people, it's just going to be a death notice. They're not going to get a full obituary. People will just mostly would post this, have this posted in the newspaper just so they can have so people will know where calling hours were or where the funeral would be. And this is actually my 4 times great-grandfather. He lived to a pretty ripe old age there. And this is all I've been able to find on him. I couldn't find an obit. So this is, again, happens in my own research. This is a pretty common occurrence to just be able to find only a death notice. So as I've already mentioned, so things have changed over time. So obituaries as we have them today and as they've existed for quite a while were not common at all until the late 19th century. The Civil War is when you started to see more and more longer write-ups outside of just short notices. Before that time, earlier mentions of anyone who died in a newspaper, for the most part, they would just have the person's name, the date and location of their death, and their age. If you got lucky, it might have their occupation or maybe how they died, but that's it. They were really brief, 1 or 2 sentences, and it'll just be a long list of people. The only exceptions to these would be if people were really well known. So someone who was important, considered important by society, they would get longer write-ups. So those are basically the only people who would have obits that resemble what we see today, just really, really well known and quote unquote important people. I have a few examples here. So this is an example of what most people would get. This is from 1863. You can see here, it's just a list of people. So this is during the Civil War. So some of these folks were people who died in the war. So you can just say, it'll say where they died, so where he died, his name, his age, and what regiment he was in. But for this person, all you get is where he died, his first 2 initials, his last name, and his age. And for this person, a lot of the times, this is pretty common. You'll see here with this third one here, Addie Imogen. If it was a particularly young person, so this person was 1 year old, if it was a really young child, oftentimes they would give a parent's name, usually the father. And sometimes you might get the name of a spouse. You can see here this person, she had her husband mentioned. But for the most part, it's really, really, really short, really short notices. And this was pretty typical from when they first started appearing in the 18th century. You can see here, this person here, his name is spelled wrong, but that is my 2 times great grandfather on a different branch of my family tree. He did serve in the Civil War. So this was the little death notice that was posted for him after he passed away. And this is from the Berkshire Eagle, which is actually still in publication. So this is a different example. So this is, again, a little bit more like what we would see now. This is from a newspaper up in Maine in 1799 after George Washington died. So because he was George Washington, founding father, first president, and all that, he got a nice write-up. There were lots of really glowing things written about him after he passed. So someone of his level would get a long write-up. Someone like an ordinary person, like any of my ancestors that were around during this time period, if they showed up in the newspaper at all, there'd just be those little quick lists like we saw on the previous slide. So that's, again, something to keep in mind, particularly if you are looking for information from someone really long ago, like in the 18th century. You're not likely to find anything unless the person you're researching was really George Washington level famous. Now we've talked a little bit about what obituaries are, how they work, and how they've changed. So now we're going to talk about how to find obituaries. So again, I am going to be focusing on how you can do that through the BPL specifically, but it's probably going to be similar process wherever you might try to find one. So, and just in general terms, so one thing to keep in mind, where do you want to look? So an obituary could be published in different newspapers and from various places. So it could be published where the deceased lived, where they were mostly a resident of, where they died. This is especially true if they died, if it was somehow extremely noteworthy, like if there was a really bad accident or something like that. There could be an obituary published where the deceased was originally from, even if they didn't live anymore, or somewhere where they lived for many years. So basically, sometimes some examples I've had is of someone who still had family in the town that they were from, and they posted an obituary because most of the family was still in that place. So that's where the obituary was published. Or it could be someone who just had a really strong association. They weren't originally from a place, but they lived there for a really long time. So there might be, people still remember them, so there might be an obituary published for them there. And also it could be that the only person who would want to submit an obituary for the deceased person, they happen to live somewhere else. So this is mostly going to be a close relative, like someone might submit an obituary for a parent, even if neither of them were from that town, they might put it there. just so because they wanted to have a notice published. The only really and the big thing here, if you're lucky enough to be researching someone who is really well known, they could be all over the place. So, for instance, we just this week, a gentleman who was in state government, I'm blanking on his name, but he passed away this week. So there was notices, there was obituaries written up for him in newspaper, news resources all over the state. Frank Bellotti. Thank you, Kathleen. Yes, that's who I was trying to think of. So Frank Bellotti passed away this week, so there were obituaries published for him in newspapers all over the state. And when someone of national renown passes away, it'll be all over the country. So like I said, when we looked at that example for George Washington, that one was from Maine. He was not from Maine, did not have any association with Maine, but he was George Washington. So they wanted to publish something for him up in Maine. So if you're lucky enough to be looking for someone of that level of renown, you won't have a hard time finding something. So now we're going to get down to the nitty gritty here. So this is what you will absolutely need in order to find anything. You need the name of the deceased. I know some folks might think this sounds funny, but we've actually had requests from folks who want an obit and they'll submit everything but the person's name. We need the person's name. That's number one. Also, very, very important is the date and location of death. If you are putting in a request at a library, I know, and I'm sure this is probably going to be true for other libraries, we can't find anything without knowing the date and location of the death. If that's something you don't know, you can't really find an obituary without that, and you can't really request one without that. So I recommend, and there's a link to this in your handout, we have a research guide specifically for obituaries. Is it going to load for me? Yes, it is. Excuse me. Okay, so and there's a whole section here about how to find the death date and location. I will say though, the easiest way to find this information, if you at least know the state that where the person died, is to get a death record or a death certificate. So again, how it works in Massachusetts, you would depending on what year the person passed, it would either be from the state archives or from the Registry of Vital Records and Statistics. So depending on the year, you would want to, in Massachusetts, you'd contact one of those places and they can do a search for you, or you can go and try to find it yourself. Once you have a death record with a death date and an exact location, then a library will be better able to help you find one, or it'll be much easier for you to find it. So that is very, very important. We need the name and the date and the location of the death. Those are the three most important things you need. So we're going to walk through an example here for microfilm. So as I just mentioned, and I want to emphasize, have the name, death date, and location of the death ready. So for instance, if you're doing this through us and you wanted to try to do this yourself, you would take a look at the newspaper's research guide. And in here, in this tab here, historical newspapers microfilm, we have a bunch of lists of all the different newspapers we have on microfilm. We have Boston newspapers, Massachusetts newspapers, and other newspapers in the US and some other specialized collections, but I'm just going to open this one just so you can see what it looks like. So this will tell you where it was published. And we also will need the call number here. That's this in the second column, the title, and the date that you're looking for. So this right here will have the dates that we have. It's not necessarily the dates that the newspaper was published. That's just what we have. There might be somehow another place that has it, but this will be what we have. So you would want to take a look at that, figure out what newspaper do you want to look at, what date. Then once you have that, at the BPL, you would go to the research services desk. That's the public desk for my department. That's located in the Washington room. You fill out a request slip for what you want. So then you give us the slip. Someone will get the film and we'll show you how to use the microfilm reader. And then we'll load it up for you. Then you're going to look for the obituary. If you find it, yay, you can print or save it, email it to yourself. But if you have trouble, You can ask us for help. Librarians are here to help you. That is most of our job, so don't be afraid to ask. So the example we're going to look at is my maternal grandmother. So this is, I know her name. So her maiden name was Archie, and my grandfather's name was William. So that's her married name. I know what day she died. It was November 1st, 1968, and she was from Pittsfield. So if I were to look back at one of those lists, I would say, well, what do we have for Pittsfield? So I can see in this time period for the year I want, in the 1960s, I'd want the Berkshire Eagle. So, and there's the call number right over there. So then I would fill out a request slip. This is what our request slips look like. So you'd write down the call number there, the name of the newspaper, and the date you're looking for. So it was early November 1968. So I'm going to ask for the whole month there. Then you put down your name, and if you're working with the BPL, you do need to have a library card. If you're here in person, if you live out of state and you're visiting, you can get a research card, but you do need to have a library card. So then someone on staff will go get it for you. So this is what I did when I was first putting this slide together a long time ago. I looked it up, and then we're gonna just see if I can make this bigger. So this is just what the page looked like. And then I had to see if I could find her in there. And I did. She was right over here. And as I said before, she's listed under my grandfather's name and not even his full name, his initials. So she's listed as Mrs. W.F. Herman. So you noticed here, she passed away on November 1st. I can say and it was published this day. I can say that's fairly unusual. You will very rarely get an obituary published the same day that the person passed. Doesn't happen very often. It did mostly in this case because it was really early in the morning when she passed. You can see here, so this is an obituary in microfilm. You can see it's fairly typical. Has her name, a little bit about what she did, her survivors, so her children, including my parents, and information about the funeral. So again, it's fairly rare that it happens that quickly, but in this case it did. She had been sick for a while. So that's in microfilm. So for a database, this is some of the steps you can take. So again, just like with microfilm, you need to have the name, the date of death, and the location of the death. So for BPL, you would take a look at our list of newspaper databases to see which one might have something useful in it. And you'd log into the database and then go to advanced search. And I am going to show you a live demonstration of this, so don't worry if it's not clicking. Then you'll put in the name of the date, and look through the results. And again, if you find it, you save it or email it to yourself and ask us for help. You can send us an email. We can help you out with that. So our next example, my great great grandfather. So he passed away in June of 1938, also in Pittsfield. So I would take a look, and we'll just show you this briefly. So this is what I did when I prepared this slide. I looked at the newspapers listed here to see what might be most helpful. And just again, so from previous experience, I knew that the newspaper archive database here has the Berkshire Eagle, which again, you could also just look, you might need to look in each database and see what newspapers they have. Again, I just know because I've used it before that they did have a newspaper from that place and that time. So I'm gonna pick newspaper archive. Then we're gonna, again, so if you're doing this from home at this point, it will ask you to type in your library card number and your PIN, but because I'm in the building, I don't need to do that. And if you do this in the building, you won't need to log in. So if you're visiting from out of state, you can use our databases while you're in the building. Okay. So again, I'm gonna go back and remember the information I had here. So his name, so I'm gonna type in Joseph Dietrich and June 1938. You don't necessarily want to put an exact date in there. Again, I don't know. Okay, I'm going to pop in a link to the handout again. There we go. Because you don't know when it was published. In my grandmother's case was rare, but for most people, it would be published a day or two after they passed. All right, so I'm going to type in his name. Hope if I There we go. Joseph Dietrich. So I'm going to narrow it down to Massachusetts and specifically Pittsfield. So I'm going to pick exact time date. And when you pick exact date, the most you need to have is a year. You don't need to pick everything out. So what I'm going to do is scroll 1938 and then June, and then click on search, and then we're going to see what comes up. So we've got 4 records here. As I said, so again, so he died on June 22nd. Let's see. Oops. Okay, let me get back there. Okay, so it was June 22nd. So the automatic sort, and this is true for a lot of databases, it will go by relevancy, but I'm particular. I like to have oldest to newest. So we're going to redo that. So here we go. So we have a bunch of different things that popped up. So we're going to click on the oldest one. So again, this is another case where he passed away early in the morning, so they were able to get an obituary in the evening paper. So that's another instance where that happened. So we're going to open this up. So in this case, not all of them will do this, but in some cases, your result will be highlighted. So you can just go ahead and find it on the page. That's not always the case, but it is here. And I'm sorry, it's a little faded. This would have to do with the quality of the newspaper they had when they filmed it. Let's see. And so you can see here, in this case, it is marked in obituaries. So they were starting to be marked as obituary section. And here we go. You can see here, it tells you how old he was. He was 78, tells you where he lived, where he died. So again, he was sick for 5 weeks. So this is pretty helpful. I did already know this information, but if I didn't, this would tell me, oh, he was born in France. And it tells you how long he had lived there, where he worked, and various other information. So who his children are. So these are just his living children. I can tell you my grandmother's mother had already passed away by this time, so she's not noted there. And so my grandmother is one of the 14 grandchildren listed here, included here. So again, it tells you information about where the funeral will be and where he was supposed to be buried. And for some reason, they also threw in who the funeral director was. So that is his obituary. So there were 4 different things in here. So just for fun, we're going to take a look at a couple of other things. Excuse me. Okay, and this one is a funeral notice. So these are considered, they will have some of the same information, but they're usually published in addition to an obituary and not just that. Okay, so here we go. It says, so this is actually not uncommon. There'll be some sort of ceremony or service at the home. And then they proceeded to the church for the mass, and then they went to the cemetery. So at the time, particularly if I know, and I can say the family was Catholic, that was actually not uncommon still. I mean, that doesn't tend to happen now, but in a lot of cases, funeral services or ceremonies would be held at the home of the deceased. Oh, I did not mean to click on that. Okay, go back. Apologies, and some new controls here, still trying to figure these out. There we go. Okay. So that was a funeral notice. So, okay, it looks like and so this is just another funeral notice. That's the same thing. So obviously they paid to have it run in multiple days, and there we go. So sometimes if you're really fortunate, you might get some information about the funeral after it has occurred. Not everyone gets it, but apparently my great-great-grandfather was well known enough to have something like that. So this tells you when it happened, who was in charge of who officiated the service, who the pallbearers were, and where he was buried, and who did the service at the grave. So this is unusual. Again, not everyone is going to get a write-up, but again, if you're fortunate enough to be researching someone who was really well known, you might get a really long write-up. And some of the things like this that I found for folks include a summary of the eulogy or what was said there. So that is pretty cool if you're fortunate enough to get that. So I will say some of the other things I found, I didn't include it here. There was some because this is just June, but when I did try looking through the whole year, and they had information about his will and who the executor was and all that. So that's just one related, semi-related cool thing that you can find in newspapers that are kind of related to obituaries, because that can also give you some more information about the family. Okay, so that is generally speaking doing things in a database. Again, this is one of the databases that we have, but a lot of public libraries will have other databases that you can search through. It'll probably be fairly similar, whatever library you happen to be using, not just us. All right, so that is the end of my slides. I'm gonna look through. It looks like we have some questions. If you have a question, you can feel free to pop it in the chat. Let me see what we have. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so Barbara's asking, are funeral homes required to keep obits after the business has ceased operation? So as far as I'm aware, there are no regulations for that because they are private businesses. So it's really, you're kind of taking a chance trying to get funeral home records. There are some archives somewhere in some places, funeral homes, someone was thoughtful enough to donate it to an archive when they found it when the business closed. A lot of funeral homes, they won't just cease operations. The funeral home, they like, for instance, this happened at a funeral home I was just researching in Rhode Island. It was taken over by another company. It still exists. It's the same building and everything, but it's just they changed their name. So that sometimes will happen. So really, because they are private businesses, yeah, I would say definitely give it a shot. If they aren't still around, the Boston Public Library, we have a database called Archive Grid that I recommend you try searching, and you can type in the name of the funeral home just to see if there's anything. But the other thing I would say is look at the address of where it was, if you can find it, and chances are there's probably still a funeral home there. It just might have a different name. That is a fairly common occurrence. So Priscilla's asking, how old is old newspapers without an obituary section? So we did talk about that a little bit. So deaths have been reported in newspapers for as long as there's been newspapers, basically. Obituary sections weren't really super common until the 20th century, generally. So, and regularly appearing obituary sections that were clearly marked and had a dedicated space, that wasn't common until after the Civil War. So it is a bit of an Easter egg hunt trying to find them in old newspapers. It can be really, really tricky. Okay, so Star's asking, can we get a research card to research online if we live elsewhere? So no, you can only get an e-card to search out online databases if you either live, work, go to school, or own property in Massachusetts. It has to do with licensing restrictions that we have from our vendors. We can't offer access to anyone outside of the state. But if you are looking for something, and particularly, like I said, if you know the name and the date and the location, you can always just send a request into us via email, and then we can scan a copy of it and send it to you. We get a ton of those requests all the time. It's a big part of what we do here. We have a massive collection of newspapers on microfilm. So this is something where we do a lot. So definitely feel free to send us an email and we can help you out with that. Okay. All right. So no hand up, so no questions yet. So I said okay. Okay, so Anne is asking, do you have many of the town and city local newspapers on file? Yes, we do. So I'm actually gonna go back to that guide. So we're gonna check out, again, there's a link to this in your handout. So let's see. So we're gonna go to research guides. And newspapers. Okay, and oh, no, I clicked on the wrong thing. Historical newspapers microfilm. So down here, we have, so this is our biggest collection of newspapers, our Massachusetts newspapers on microfilm. So we don't have them for every city and town in Massachusetts, but we do have a heck of a lot. So this list is 74 pages long. If you were to come into the library and come to the research services desk, you'd see we have a really thick binder with all the list of all of the microfilm we have on newspapers. So we do have a lot. See here, we have all over the state, not just the Boston area. It's quite a bit here. Like I said, 74 pages. So we have a lot of these on film. Again, the dates here are just what we have, not necessarily the dates it was published. And a lot of times it's the same, but sometimes it's just what we have. So Frank is asking, is microfilm available at BPL branch locations? No, it is not. This collection is housed at the Central Library in Copley Square. So if you did want to try to do your research yourself, you would need to come to the Central Library in order to do that. They don't have it at the branches. So Brian is asking, are private entities scanning old newspapers into databases? And if so, is it economical to use their services? So yes, there are. There's one of the databases we have, which actually I'm going to click to over here, newspapers, databases so there's a database called MyHeritage that actually scanned a bunch of our newspapers. We worked with them on a project for that. So a lot of the Massachusetts newspapers they have in this database were scanned from our collections. So that is definitely a thing that happens a lot. If it's economical, that really depends on what you're trying to do. So we do subscribe to a bunch of newspaper databases. We don't subscribe to all of them, though. There's a couple of really big ones that we don't have. Newspapers.com is the big one that we don't have access to. And there's another thing called American Historical Newspapers that we also don't have access to. So if you're looking to kind of do it yourself and not necessarily do it through a library, a lot of these places will offer free trials. So if you just want to look up one thing and you don't want long-term access to it, I would say go for the free trial or go through a library. But if you're looking to do a lot of research and you have a big project and you want to have access to something a library doesn't have for a really long time, then yes, it probably would be worth it. But that's something that you generally have to decide for yourself. These databases, they're all a little different. You can see here this one has a different interface than the one I showed you. So again, it all really depends. Okay. Okay, so Carol's asking, do you need an appointment to come into Copley if we want to look up a few obits? No, you don't need an appointment. You can come in anytime we're open. However, if you think you might need a lot of microfilm, so like I said, if you have a big project and there's a lot of film you want to look at, you can definitely email us. We prefer email, contact us ahead of time so we can pull stuff together for you. So we can do that, but you don't need an appointment. The only time I would say if you might want an appointment is if you need a lot of help, if you need step-by-step instructions and how to do it, and you want one of us to sit with you while you do your research, then you can make an appointment through the Book a Librarian service. So that would be under services and book librarians. So right now we only have appointments Tuesdays and Wednesdays, but if you want if you want one-on-one help, you're more than welcome to book an appointment. But if you just want to come in and do it, you can just come in anytime we're open. We're on the second floor in the old building from the Dartmouth Street entrance. So that's the McKim building. Just ask for the Washington room. That's where we are. Okay. All right. So it looks like that. Okay. So Brian is asking, are federal immigration records available? So It's a little outside the topic of what we're doing, but I will say, so there are some records available on ancestry.com. There are things like passenger listings, and they do have some naturalization records, but it's not comprehensive. It really depends on what time period you're looking at and where the person would came into and things like that, and like what kind of records you're looking for. If you're looking for something specific, definitely feel free to contact us. You can send us an email and we'll see what we can do. Sorry about, I keep clearing my throat. It's dusty in here. All right, so we'll wait a couple of minutes. We got plenty of time here. So this is the last class of the fall series. We will be coming back with more classes. We'll probably be starting in March. We don't have a schedule finalized yet, so I can't say what the topic will be or when exactly that will be. You can just keep an eye on our webpage for more information. We have a genealogy page that'll have genealogy related events listed on the right-hand side here. So, and also, if you live near the Rosendale branch, there's a genealogy club over there. Definitely check that out if you're interested in that. The Mattapan branch is doing an African American genealogy boot camp in April. So definitely check that out. And when we get the schedule finalized, we will have that up there. Okay, and also, so related to that, so for those of you who might have come in late, I will be sending an email to everyone tomorrow that will have a link to the handout and my presentation slides and also the chat transcript. So if you missed something, you don't need to worry, you'll get that. This class is being recorded. I will send a link to the recording to everyone once it's up, but just want to warn you, the department that handles our videos, there's only 2 people that work there, and one of them is on vacation for the rest of the year. So it might be a little while before that gets up there. So we just ask that you please be patient. But in the meantime, if you want to look at other things, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our classes are up on YouTube. Oops. Nope, that's not what I meant to do. There we go. You can just go to the BPL's YouTube channel. And so this is, oh, well, they got me on the front page. So there's a bunch of playlists, including genealogy. So you can see there's 32 things in there right now. That's classes over the past couple of years, and also some guest lecturers that we've had in. So definitely take a look at that while you're waiting for us to come back next year. Okay, I see. Well, thank you for all the kind words, everyone. That's great to see. It's always, like I say, it's always nice to know that we're appreciated. So I want to thank everyone who came tonight and everyone who might have come to any of our previous presentations this fall. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Like, we really love doing these. If you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to see, you can leave a comment in the survey that will come up when we close out here, or you can send us an email if you have any thoughts. So I just want to wish everyone have a good night and happy holidays, and I will see you next year. All right, take care.